Welcome to The World This Week, the podcast which examines the impact of the week's news with BBC correspondents around the world. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Hello, I'm Sean Lay and welcome to The World This Week, the programme that tells you how the world has changed in the past 7 days. This was the week when the world learnt that a second HIV patient appeared to have it no longer. Finding the on-off switch.
Finding the on-off switch, yes.
Could turning it off open up a cure? The week when Canada's Prime Minister admitted he should have known, but insisted he didn't.
I was not aware of that erosion of trust. As Prime Minister and leader of the federal ministry, I should have been.
When Algeria's president defied protests to run for re-election from a Swiss hospital bed, we'll also be asking why Westminster 2019 seems like Paris 1940, and Cindy Sue considers another lesson from history.
As I watched the Trump-Kim talks end without agreement, I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if China-US talks in the 1970s had failed.
A dozen years ago, there was the Berlin patient being treated for cancer who, having received a bone marrow transplant, saw his other illness, HIV, apparently vanish. A fluke? Scientists feared so, until a second case revealed this week. The London patient, as he's called, also with HIV, also treated for cancer, has been in remission for 18 months now. Scientists have been unable to find any sign of the infection. They're careful to say it's not a cure, but it might just point the way to one. HIV is a cruel virus which strips the body's immune system, leaving someone who has it at the mercy of infections. Relatively minor ones can prove fatal. 70 million people are known to have acquired HIV since it was first identified almost 40 years ago. Half of them have died. I've been talking to Fergus Walsh, the BBC's medical correspondent.
This patient had cancer as well as having HIV, and he needed a bone marrow transplant. They couldn't generate the stem cells from the patient himself, so they needed a donor. They sought out and were lucky enough to find a donor who is one of the 1% of people of Northern European descent who have a double mutation which makes them immune, more or less, to HIV. It's a mutation called CCR5. They gave the bone marrow transplant to this chap, primarily to cure him of this cancer of his lymphatic system, part of the immune system. And as a byproduct of that, it passed on this resistance to HIV. They can't say he's cured, but it's looking very positive.
Now, it's interesting, as you say, they can't use the C word. He's been in long-term remission, they're saying. What is the nervousness about applying that word?
Because there have been a couple of other cases where just one of the two sets of DNA had the CCR5 mutation. And in those cases, actually, after a while, the HIV reservoir returned. HIV is a very wily foe. Let's talk about the Berlin patient, because that was back, I think, in 2007. He was the first person to have exactly the same treatment. In fact, he had 2 stem cell transplants, and he has been off all HIV medication for over a decade. The researchers are saying they are confident he is cured now. Not only is he cured, he's pretty much immune from HIV. So the next question, obviously, is, well, let's do this for everybody.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it sounds simple.
It sounds simple, but it's not. A bone marrow transplant is a big deal. Lots of toxic effects. Both the Berlin patient and the anonymous man we're calling the London patient both had what they call graft versus host disease, where the new immune system kind of attacks the body, and that actually might be one of the reasons why the new immune system takes over and successfully confers this immunity.
But a very aggressive way to try and treat it.
Yes, it's potentially very aggressive. It's costly as well. You'd need to find a lot of donors who would be able to give up their stem cells. There aren't that many of them around. So completely impractical. Plus, people who are on HIV antiretroviral treatment, generally speaking, are healthy.
It's no longer the fatal disease for many that it was.
Not at all. People with HIV have a near normal life expectancy, and where they are on treatment, the main concerns they have now are the diseases of ageing.
What about the impact potentially of a cure for those many millions of people who are at risk of contracting HIV in countries where, let's face it, the availability of antiretroviral drugs is not good, and where the cost of it is something that the state is often not prepared or able to meet?
Well, I think there's a lot of energy that's now going into looking at this CCR5 mutation as both a means of preventing people being infected in the first place and then of somehow conferring a treatment which may ultimately cure patients who have HIV. There's work going in both areas there, be particularly applicable to the millions of people who are not on HIV medication, who face a real risk. There are still huge numbers of deaths from HIV in the developing world. So we need to be cautious about how far we push this, but I think the focus on the CCR5 mutation, gives a lot of hope and a lot of promise, which scientists are now grasping with both hands.
Fergus Walsh. Weeks of protest haven't deterred Abdulaziz Bouteflika. We're told that Algeria's president intends to stand for re-election in April, seeking a fifth term in an office he's held for 20 years. I say we're told because Mr Bouteflika doesn't speak, not in public at least, and hasn't for several years. He suffered a major stroke in 2013. Indeed, using a phrase like stand for re-election seems a bit inappropriate, since he's stuck in a hospital bed in Switzerland. In contrast to other countries in the region, and indeed its own history, Algeria hasn't seen any attempt to suppress the street demonstrations against the president. Police have been restrained and the armies remained in barracks. Algeria is run by Le Pouvoir, the power, a network of politicians, top business people and securocrats. They, like the ailing president himself, represent a bygone age. Some are mujahideen, veterans of Algeria's independence movement, which won freedom from France more than half a century ago. Others were involved in the brutal, blood-soaked civil war which followed when, in the 1990s, an election victory by Islamists was cancelled by the military. Mr Bouteflika and Le Pouvoir are backed by many Algerians because they restored stability. For others, though, they've overstayed their welcome. I asked Nahed Abuzaid of the BBC's Arabic service about the protests and how they were initially perceived when they first broke out.
There was not quite the social support that we see now. People have not yet gained the popular legitimacy. And everybody was asking the question, who these people are, who is behind them, and what do they really, really want? You want change, but what do you really want? Now, everybody seems to have gotten the message, including the authorities. And two landmarks here is that on the one hand, although the president is very adamant about his legitimacy to run for a fifth term, he conceded in a way that saying, okay, I won't run for a full fifth term, a very brief one, after which I will no longer nominate again for presidency. And on the other hand, there is the security forces who are known to be very heavy-handed and crack down on protesters who represent the slightest challenge to the status quo, not interfering, but keeping things in perspective and in order.
So restraint from the security forces, which people are not necessarily used to seeing in Algeria, and a president who has looked pretty much untouchable for the last 20 years, suddenly saying, look, give me a couple more years and then I'll be gone. I mean, that actually is quite a dramatic shift then.
Exactly. If you look back at the presidents and the presidencies in the era after the post-revolution, post-liberation, as they like to call it.
So post-1962.
62. All of the presidents have actually either been mujahid themselves or have close association to the mujahideen. Therefore, the legitimacy for any presidential candidate had to have some sort of a link to the revolution that liberated the people.
So that revolutionary generation remained and have remained in charge.
Until Bouteflika. And Bouteflika may well be the last of that generation. Because what we are seeing now is a generational shift between the revolutionary legitimacy, and maybe we will be calling this in a few years' time the big intifada legitimacy, or the big uprising legitimacy, or the change legitimacy.
And that can be a dangerous moment, can't it? One thinks of the Arab Spring back in 2011 and all those countries where young people felt frustrated and their opportunities hadn't materialised, and there were the older generation they perceived holding them back. But in many cases, it not only turned violent, it ended up provoking counter-revolution.
Indeed it has. And what Bouteflika has done, although his first 2 terms at least have been credited with lots of achievements, he has pacified the country after the big black decade, as they call it, and then he has motivated some reforms and pushed the economy a little bit further. Nevertheless, Bouteflika, in the second 2 terms, his style was to, as one academic would call it, desertify politics in Algeria. There's no opposition parties except some satellite, non-significant parties. There is only close associates who grab the power, and there's also only one man who calls the shot. And that is the danger that we have seen in other countries where people have felt really angry about the entire power and the authorities being summed up in one person's hand. When that person is gone, what we've seen happening is the entire country collapsing into chaos. That's one thing. The other thing also, the military is a very hard factor in the political equation in Algeria. But the military also will need to tread very carefully, because in the past, the military has been blamed for interfering and annulling the results of a democratic election, as it was described back then.
And that prompted the most terrible bloodshed.
Absolutely, more than 200,000 killed. But then it took them a long time to regain the trust and the confidence of the populace, and then became the saviors, as it were.
So the protesters, the opponents of President Bouteflika running again, actually now have 2 potentially powerful advantages. One, a president who has admitted he can't or won't remain in office for very long, even if he is re-elected. Secondly, a military that, for very good reasons, is reluctant to take any precipitate action.
They also have more than 2 things going for them. We have seen cracks starting to appear in the structure of the ruling party. People are starting to voice their concerns, if not opposition, or remain silent. And the other thing is all the syndicates and the professional bodies are starting also to voice concerns.
So you're talking about, you say, syndicates, the professional organisations, teachers, lawyers,
absolutely.
That kind of thing.
And then also the biggest thing is the National Association of Mujahideen. Bouteflika has always described himself as being a mujahid. If that association comes out not only not supporting you, but saying they want you to go, that is a big loss.
Nahid Abazaid, you're listening to The World This Week, the programme that tells you what happened in the past 7 days and why it counts. And if you enjoy factual podcasts like ours, you might also be interested in trying, well, have a listen to this.
Hi, this is Kim Chakaneta, and I'm the host of the Conversation podcast from the BBC World Service. To celebrate International Women's Day, I want to tell you about our show. The Conversation brings together 2 women to talk about something they have in common. It could be a passion, a profession, or even a shared experience. We have an incredible array of guests, everyone from beatboxers to professional boxers, Olympic gymnasts to Nobel Prize-winning scientists.
A lot of times women sort of get lumped together like we're just all one thing and we all think alike. And of course we can't all have had the same experiences and we can't all think alike.
And we're also taking it on the road. We're going to all these different countries to hear from the women living in those countries about what it means to them to be a woman there today.
Being a woman in Ireland means I can move around freely, but I still can't avoid sexual harassment.
Being a woman in Pakistan means I'm covering my head, not my brain.
Extraordinary conversations with extraordinary women and a really good listen for everyone. Search for The Conversation wherever you found this podcast.
It's been another wait-and-see week over Brexit, Britain's planned exit from the European Union. The UK government's top lawyer spent much of it in Brussels searching for a compromise that might persuade enough MPs to vote next week in favour of the withdrawal deal agreed with Brussels but then rejected at Westminster, where our correspondent Rob Watson has spent another week waiting and waiting.
I remember as a staggeringly pretentious teenager reading a novel by Jean-Paul Sartre describing the strange atmosphere in Paris in the period leading up to the Second World War. To briefly revisit some of that teenage pretension, it seemed to me there was a similarly eerie mood at Westminster this week, a mix of grim gaiety and apprehension ahead of the potential storm next week. By storm, of course, I am referring to the 3 big votes facing MPs. The first, on whether to approve Theresa May's deal with the EU. The second, if that's rejected, on whether to approve leaving the EU without any deal at all. And the third, if that's rejected, on whether to ask the EU for a delay to the whole Brexit process. So, in the parliamentary equivalent of the cafes of pre-war Paris, life is entirely dominated by journalists like me asking any politicians they see, and any politicians asking each other and asking us reporters, what do you think's going to happen? Unfortunately, for the purposes of this postcard, no one knows for sure. There is broad agreement that much depends on whether the pro-Brexit right of the governing Conservative Party decides that much as it hates Mrs May's deal, it's better than all the uncertainty that might come with any delay to the Brexit process. I can't help feeling old Jean-Paul would have loved the element of existential crisis and end-of-era feeling that swirls around Brexit.
Rob Watson. No one's leaning on the UK's Attorney-General to get him to change his legal advice on Brexit. In Canada, though, the allegation that the equivalent figure, the Minister of Justice, was placed under undue pressure by the Prime Minister's office is turning into a major political scandal. This week, for the first time, Justin Trudeau, the PM, tried to explain himself. He defended requests made to Jody Wilson-Raybould, the now ex-Justice Minister, to avoid a criminal trial for a big Canadian company accused of corruption. SNC-Lavalin, which employs 9,000 people in Canada, was accused of bribing Libyan officials to secure contracts there. Under Canadian law, a conviction would entail a potentially crippling, decade-long ban on bidding for government business. Until now, Mr Trudeau has been a rock-star politician, young, personable, good-looking, the neophyte who took his party from third to first place in the 2015 federal election. Matthew Laser in Quebec, where SNC-Lavalin is based, says his image has taken a real hit.
If you look at the polls, for example, from this week, he lost many points. The Liberals were 39 points in January. They're now down to 34, and the Conservatives, for the first time, are ahead with 35. The main problem here is that when he reacted on Thursday in front of the media, he did not apologise. He just recognised there was an issue, and he said it was a breach of confidence between his principal secretary and the former Attorney General. But if you look at the other sides, he really thinks that he did nothing wrong, so why would he apologise?
On the detail of this story, the allegation appears to be that this official in his office, who has resigned, was putting, in the view of the Justice Secretary, former Justice Minister, putting undue pressure on her over this case of the SNC-Lavalin. But no one is suggesting the Prime Minister himself was directly involved. So what's the problem, do you think, for Justin Trudeau in these allegations? In
a way, the Prime Minister directly spoke to her as well. He met her in September and she told him she made her decision, and he just replied, why won't she reconsider everything? And she accepted to do it. So Trudeau was involved as well in it. But the problem is his entire Prime Minister office spoke to her several times, 10 times in total. She's saying that she felt that was a lot of pressure. So this is why we think it tarnishes Trudeau's image.
The paradox, I suppose, is that it could be quite a popular thing to be seen by many Canadians to have done, because by trying to get this kind of deal arrangement that the company was keen on and which the Prime Minister seemed to be keen on, it would have potentially safeguarded thousands of jobs.
That's the main argument from the Liberal Party. They're saying that could save 9,000 jobs at risk. Why? Because SNC-Lavalin just said that if they lose the trial, they might just leave Montreal and Quebec itself and just go to London. And that will be a terrible blow for the country, for Quebec. And why is it important for the Liberal Party? It's because Quebec is their main stronghold. And it's also where Justin Trudeau comes from. He's the MP of Papineau, which is a district within Montreal.
What do you think his prospects are of putting this behind him and actually surviving it?
It's mitigated because, for example, next week the Parliament is not seating. So the Conservatives and the opposition in general will not be able to grill the Prime Minister. And then you'll have the federal budget the following week, and so that might be the main news. So maybe he'll manage to put this behind him. But you have to know that the investigation from the Justice Committee is not done, and there's also another investigation on its way, but the second one could take months until you have an answer to it. It could happen that this will go behind him. But that's pretty unlikely looking at what Canadians want, and that's the main thing. What Canadians want is the truth on this story.
Matthew later. Last week's summit in Hanoi between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un ended prematurely and without agreement, but attempts to stabilise the Korean peninsula and open up North Korea aren't finished. Mr. Trump's national security advisor said this week that the president was open to the idea of fresh talks. This despite reports that Pyongyang has begun rebuilding the factory which produced the first missiles capable of reaching the continental United States, a facility partly dismantled in the wake of the more successful first US-North Korea summit held last year. This isn't the first time the United States has faced an intractable East Asian opponent. Here's Cindy Su in Taiwan.
As I watched the Trump-Kim talks end without agreement, I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if China-US talks in the 1970s had failed. China then was like North Korea now, closed, repressive, poor. I was just a toddler, but adults like my cousin eagerly awaited news, hoping for a breakthrough. Sent to the countryside to do hard labor, like many young people at the time, he would hide under a blanket to secretly listen to Hong Kong or Macau radio stations. Despite the signals being jammed, he learned that Nixon had flown to China on a Boeing 737 and had brought a huge entourage with him. I felt very strange because all along we were opposing the U.S., my cousin told me. We had all been brainwashed. We couldn't access information and couldn't leave China. Everything was controlled. It was like being a frog at the bottom of a well. You look up to see a bit of the sky and think it's only that big. We thought Americans were like bandits. North Koreans must have also felt confused when they learned their leader had decided to meet with the President of the United States, a country they've long been taught was the capitalist enemy. But like North Koreans today, my cousin knew back then that America was wealthier and talks could lead to a better life for Chinese people. At that time, each person was allotted less than 400 grams of pork and only around 10 kilograms of rice a month. I was always hungry, my cousin told me. Like North Koreans today, many Chinese try to escape. About half of the young people in my cousin's neighborhood had tried to swim or flee by boat to nearby Hong Kong or Macau. Some drowned, others were arrested. In the end, my cousin didn't have to risk his life. After the United States and China normalized relations in 1979, many people like him with relatives in the U.S. were able to immigrate to America. Better relations also gave China's leaders more incentive to carry out economic reforms, which lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and eventually transformed the country into the world's second biggest economy. What made the Sino-US talks a success was that both sides needed each other. The U.S. was competing with the Soviet Union for dominance and wanted China on its side. At the same time, Chinese and Soviet relations had turned sour. Despite China having nuclear weapons back then, denuclearization wasn't even an issue. China wasn't threatening to use the weapons. The situation with North Korea and the U.S. now is different. North Korea isn't nearly as geopolitically important to the U.S. as China was back then. So Washington is focusing on the only thing it thinks it needs from Pyongyang, denuclearization. Without that, it's reluctant to lift sanctions. It's not easy to determine the right approach, but there are some possible lessons from the past. First, demanding Kim give up his nuclear weapons may be unrealistic. China certainly wouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons if the U.S. had made that a precondition. Kim sees them as a key to his survival. It may be more realistic to demand obtainable concessions, such as gradually opening the economy or even improving human rights. For Kim, he may do well learning from China, not focusing on his nuclear weapons, but offering other incentives instead. Second, negotiations can take a long time. For China, it took nearly a decade, longer still if you consider earlier efforts. Patience and wise diplomacy are crucial. Third, perhaps most importantly, the focus should be on improving the lives of North Korea's 25 million people. Their sufferings are worse than Chinese people's in the 1970s.
Cindy Su. That's it from the world this week, this time. If you've got any thoughts on what we've done, or there's a story you think we should be doing on a future edition, then do please contact us at BBC World Service via Facebook or Twitter. And don't forget to join Caroline Wyatt at the same time next week for a look back at what's happened in the next 7 days.